Okay, thanks. So I don't know if I have to call this to order, but it's 7:34. We're calling this listening session to order. I'm going to chime in here and there, but I just want to kind of have a free flow after folks can make some intro remarks. And with Susan being overseas, I'd love to have her start out just in the interest of time, since it's rather late where she is. So Susan, go ahead.
Okay, thanks again. Okay, so again, I am the liaison to the Ethics Committee, and I'd like to provide some context for the amendment that we'll be discussing tonight. And yes, here's the chart. Okay, to be clear, the amendment is a one-sentence revision to align the code with existing village policy that since 2019 has required all committee members to submit an oath of office and conflict of interest statement. The amendment does not add a new requirement. The 2021 expansion codified a procedure to uphold oath of office and conflict of interest obligations while ensuring confidentiality and due process. Currently, volunteers who take the oath but are not covered by the code do not have these protections. The committee recommended the amendment to provide a consistent application of the code and ensure all committee members are entitled to the same protections. As the chart illustrates, looking at the process employed by the committee in formulating the recommendation, there have been abundant opportunities for resident and council input at every step of the process. Well, as a council member, I welcome your input here tonight. It should be noted that despite the numerous opportunities for resident comment, only 4 residents have expressed concerns. It's most unfortunate that the Ethics Committee, which has worked tirelessly to promote village ethics through training and raising awareness, was not invited to attend tonight's forum, with one council member citing the residents, the need for a safe space, excuse me. One committee council member cited the need for a safe space. One of the purported reasons for this forum is to determine why some residents refuse to volunteer. Going forward, I strongly suggest that hyperbolic and inflammatory rhetoric, as we've seen, is actually the cause. I'd like to briefly respond to a couple of points made by the residents who signed a letter opposing the ordinance, not merely this amendment. Number one, $0 have been spent on ethics investigations since the ethics law was expanded in 2021. In very sharp contrast to 2020, when there were serious breaches of ethical obligations, or at least apparent breaches, which were not able to be pursued because there wasn't a law that covered those breaches. But the expenditures were significant. Number two, while claiming the ordinance has a chilling effect on volunteering, many of the signatories have volunteered to serve on covered committees since 2021. What is truly chilling is a group of residents questioning the fitness of their neighbors to serve on volunteer committees. Truly chilling. Thank you all.
Thanks, Susan.
Hey, Andrew, can you get someone to mute themselves? There's a lot of paper shuffling. It's hard to hear. Thank you.
Sure. And I don't know if the mechanics of this is for folks to be able to unmute themselves versus the village manager having that control. I think it's okay for folks to have that ability to chime in politely. But yeah, if you can go on mute if you're not speaking, that would be great. Susan, thank you very much. I want to offer the other council members to speak briefly if they would like to, or we can open it up to resident comments and interaction, and or call on our council as well at times that we might require his feedback. Council being COUNSEL. Thank you very much.
Sure, Andrew. Hi, it's Jeff. Can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes. Hi, Jeff.
Awesome. Well, first of all, I just want to thank everyone for their time. I also want to thank fellow council members for agreeing to have this listening forum. I know that this has been something that our residents have been clamoring for when it comes to whether it's the introduction of new ordinances or amendments, and the idea of having a standalone discussion that would be separate from the day of a vote for adoption. So really kudos for really making that happen. Also, I just want to share this Thursday, where there is a scheduled vote for adoption. I think that's where I'll have a chance to chime in as a council member. Perhaps there'll be opportunities at some point along the discussion today if it warrants, but really I'm here to listen and to learn and to hear from our residents what their thoughts are, pros and cons. And again, I really want to just acknowledge and appreciate all those who took the time to attend, but also recognize there were some opinions and thoughts that have been shared, and recognizing that this isn't simply an amendment, but this is something that has been, I think, a point of real, I don't know if I want to say contention, but certainly there's been a lot of thoughts and views about the ethics, the expanded jurisdiction. And I think that's why you're seeing an outpouring this evening, recognizing that now that this is proposed to be expanded to all volunteers and not just those who have certain positions that we had clarified when this was first being proposed and it was adopted. So with that said, turn it over to the residents and really looking forward to hearing from them. Thanks so much.
Well, let's wait and see real briefly if Katie or Arthur have any quick comments before we open it up.
I'm ready to hear from the people. It's fine. I'm good.
Let the
Yeah.
people speak. Okay, so
That's
if you
right.
want to raise your hands electronically, and I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself probably on your own, but let's just try and keep it orderly. I'll keep track of who raises their hands first, and we'll just go in order. And then maybe there's an opportunity to just have a back and forth as well. So who'd like to kick this one off? Looks like Peter's ready to pounce, but maybe not. Electronic hands.
Well,
Is the end of the discussion?
no.
Go, Peter.
Let me see here. I'll raise my hand.
Okay.
I do have a few things to say about this ordinance, and I am concerned about it, and I share Susan's concerns that ethics be upheld in the village. I certainly share that point of view, and I would like to see that implemented. And I also want to say that I appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight. I appreciate the council holding this hearing and to address the issues that have caused many residents to be concerned about it. So I'd like to address just a couple of issues that, in my mind, go to the fundamental fairness of the way the ethics ordinance is structured. And let me just, there are a couple of points I want to make. The first has to do with the issue of recusal. Recusal of members of the committee when appropriate. In the current law, recusal is voluntary, and there is no oversight of the recusal process. This is an unusual way to treat the important issue of recusal, which is fundamental to the fairness of the tribunal, to the judging body, especially because in this case, the ethics committee assumes the role of investigators, prosecutors, as well as judges. The state of Maryland treats recusal of judges as completely mandatory and in a wide range of circumstances. To judge from Maryland's rules governing the performance of judicial duties, a judge shall disqualify himself or herself in any proceeding in which the judge's impartiality might reasonably be questioned, including the following circumstances. And there's a list of them, but the first is the judge has a personal bias or prejudice concerning a party or party's attorney, or personal knowledge of the facts that are in dispute in the proceeding. It's significant in my mind that in the single matter that has come before the committee, the matter of one council member endorsing other candidates for the village council, the issue of recusal never arose, and none of the members of the committee chose to recuse themselves. Indeed, it seemed not even to enter their minds as far as I could tell. This was, of course, not a full case, but the VMA ordinance applies to, quote, debates or determinations with respect to a conflict of interest or an inability to execute his or her duties with impartiality, unquote. So recusal was still appropriate here under the ordinance. And of course, in principle, the fact that the committee was determining not guilt or innocence, but only whether a violation of the ethics law was alleged. So no recusals occurred, even though one of the committee members is well known as a personal friend of the person who was accused in that allegation. Another member of the committee had been appointed by that very person to draft the law under which this ethics to draft this ethics law. And at a later time, one of the members of the committee, although not in this particular case, one of the subsequent members of the committee was someone who had been endorsed by the council member in question. And yet the problem of recusal, or the issue of recusal, never arose, did not seem to be important to the members of the committee, perhaps did not occur to them, even though that, of course, is fundamental, not just to judging guilt or innocence, but also to judging the appropriateness of the case. Secondly, the issue of appointment. Those appointed to the committee must not be strongly allied with one or another political faction within the village. It's no secret at this point that the village has to some extent devolved into factions, and feelings have at times run high between these different factions. An ethics committee strongly biased in favor of one or the other of these factions is incapable of being fair to members of the opposite faction, because they have already decided how they wish to view the other side's members and positions. This ethics committee, as it is currently constituted, seems to me to be strongly weighted in favor of one of the factions and strongly opposed to the other. Under these circumstances, members of that disfavored faction cannot expect to receive fair treatment from the committee. This places a powerful weapon in the hands of one faction to cripple and intimidate the other. The assignment of volunteers to the ethics committee for that reason must be mindful of the range of opinions and sympathies in the village and strive to appoint a panel that fairly represents both factions. Without this, the committee is far from being an instrument of honest justice, and instead is a political weapon to implement the preferences and personal animosities of the prevailing faction. In that case, members of the disadvantaged faction would be foolhardy to volunteer for committees, because running afoul of the other faction's preferences might give rise to ethics charges, whereas exactly the opposite seems to be the case for members of that prevailing faction, of that dominant faction. Members of that faction can serve on committees without fear of challenge. So I think there's a fundamental unfairness there. There's one other issue that I would like to raise, and that is, excuse me for just a moment while I find it in my notes. And that goes to the issue of legal assistance and funding for prosecutors, but not for the accused. The full resources of the village seem to be available to the committee to prosecute a case, and yet, of course, being prosecuted would almost necessarily require that the accused, him or herself, seek legal representation and might bear significant expenses. Furthermore, the full resources of the village itself, that is the files and the assistance of the staff, are at the disposal of the committee, whereas none of that is available to the accused. And this seems fundamentally unfair to me. And if we are continue to have volunteers for village committees, this has to be changed because no one is anxious to bear the really significant costs of representation before charges that may or may not have any real substance to them at all. And yet that person can be attacked and harassed by the bringing of charges. And so, I think there are fundamental issues of fairness that pervade this ordinance. I don't think it's impossible to draft a more fair ordinance, but as it is currently implemented and currently run, I am really concerned about the fairness of it. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And I'm going to reserve my comments for when folks have spoken. I don't want to interject. So who'd like to speak? Holly, please.
Sorry. Thank you. Can you, I have a couple questions and a comment. Can you tell me exactly what the problem is that this ordinance is solving? Anyone? Does anyone know on the council?
Yes, yeah, this is Arthur Alexander, I'll jump in. It's a very simple ordinance. It simply extends the coverage of the ordinance to other committees. Right now, it is limited to the Election and Ethics Committee. In fact, the Community Engagement Committee, what I like to call the Party Committee, actually has the most opportunity. I'll put myself on camera so you can see. The Community Engagement Committee has the greatest opportunity for favoritism because they spend real dollars on real events. And just I am not accusing anyone on the Community Engagement Committee of anything, but a purely hypothetical. If they hated the chefs at La Ferme for some personal reason, they could decide not to act in a fair manner and to direct business away from them, or they could direct the business down to their best friend at the Olympia Cafe. So this extends the ethics to all committees, including temporary committees, ad hoc committees, like the former tree committee or the safety committee or the walkability. That's what it does. It extends the scope of ethics to all village committees.
I didn't ask what it does. I do understand what it does. What I'm asking you is, or anyone here who has the answer, is what problem are we solving? Is there a problem we've had? That's my one question. And number two, Ron Bolt, I hope you can address this if it's okay. What do other villages have to have ethics rules for their committees? What's the common procedure in other villages like Somerset and any other neighborhoods that are self-governed that way? Do they have ethics rules for volunteers?
Should I answer, Andrew? Okay, great. So just to add to what Arthur said, in November 2019, the council passed a resolution adopting a policy requiring all committee members to take an oath. The oath was developed, but the code wasn't amended to put the force of law behind that policy. So right now we've got a policy that says all committee members take the oath, but a code that says only certain people take the oath. So this amendment would marry the two. It would conform the code to the policy. As we've discussed at prior meetings, and based on research I conducted and research conducted by former ethics committee members, it is, I think, fair to say it's uncommon for the non-statutory committees to take an oath and be subject to the ethics ordinance. It's not unheard of. I think I found a couple examples in Florida, Arizona, where local governments did require that, but among my 10 clients here in the county, it is uncommon. Martin's Additions is the only one. But then, as I often say, laws are often scar tissue, reactive. Martin's Additions had issues that it reacted to in 2019 in adopting the policy. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that was really helpful. I appreciate it.
Sure.
I will tell you that I think this is the entire issue is unnecessary. I think it's an overreach, and I think there is a faction in the village who believes more in control. And I think that the council members, I'm not singling anyone out in any way, as I appreciate you volunteering, can be inspired to make this a better village, not to put more control in place. And to me, believing that I could be sanctioned by a neighbor for volunteering on a committee and doing something that they believed was wrong with no recusal is unacceptable. And it's a very unneighborly thing to say, to do. Lastly, I'll say that when the liaison to this ethics committee, Susan Fadig, was describing the sequence of events that have led to this proposal, the approach that she took about which felt to me hostile to a member of the community by discussing how many opportunities we've had to contribute to this conversation was offensive. And I really hope for the council to be, and the ethics committee and all committees, to be inclusive and not disparaging of their neighbors. But I felt a strong sense of disparagement by her comment. And I really hope that the tone on the council is not that toward the neighbors. I don't personally think committee members need to take an oath of office or be patrolled. And I think we are in a situation where we have a group in the village that feel that people need to be controlled. And I just think it's not the spirit of our kind neighborhood. It's not in the spirit of our kind neighborhood. So I'm against this. I was against the previous ethics proposal. And I just wanted to say that. So thanks for listening. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. Susan.
Hi, thank you for your patience and letting me speak. And thank you so much for having this session, this listening session tonight. I really appreciate it. I think there's been a lot of concern, and it's fantastic to have an opportunity to weigh in on this adjustment to, or proposal to expand the ethics ordinance to additional volunteers in the community. My concern is mainly about accountability for the people on the committee, and having the committee be the first line of hearing when there's an ethics complaint or concern in the community. I feel like the council has a little bit offloaded their responsibility in this regard. I feel that the council should be the first ones to listen or hear about if there is a concern about an ethics case. And someone has said, well, what if the council member themselves are involved in being accused? Well, then they can certainly at that point say, I'll refer this case on. We have a conflict of interest. But the obvious, it's clear that the same logic would apply to committee members. If committee members had a conflict of interest, likewise, one would hope that they would refer the case on to the council to hear as opposed to the committee. But the only difference there is that the council is accountable to me in an electoral sense. If I'm not happy with something that council members have done, at least I know every 2 years we can have an election, we can vote for someone else, we can campaign for someone else, et cetera. And we can hopefully get people in place who represent our views on the council. But if a committee member is biased in some way, or we're concerned about their behavior as a fellow resident at the same lateral level, then I don't really have any recourse in an electoral sense. And in fact, the committee members have become even additionally insulated by having their terms not coincide with the terms of council members, but intentionally go over so that they don't get switched out when every year when there's a new full set of council members. So I'm very concerned that if there were any bias among council committee members, that there's no recourse for residents if we have a complaint in some way. But this is not just against residents who are committee members. I think it may be more comforting to themselves to know that they're not necessarily the first in line to decide whether there should be an ethics violation or a case investigated or use village funds in that way. And in fact, I thought that when I went to one meeting of the ethics committee, and they were discussing this proposal to expand the ordinance to additional volunteers, one thing that one committee member said was that we're not ahead of the council on this proposal. In fact, the idea for this proposal came from one council member. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So it wasn't necessarily, it didn't necessarily originate in the committee itself. This idea to expand it may have come from one council member, not the entire council, but one. Okay, well, that's all right. We know that ideas do originate with one person, but I think there was a sense of comfort that we're not trying to foist this on everyone. We're this committee of fellow residents, and we've been instructed by the council that this would be a good idea. So in the same way, however, I would prefer to have cases, if I were on the ethics committee, I would prefer that cases be referred to me by the council rather than me or other committee members deciding on our own what ethics cases should be considered. And this really comes into play. And when we interact with residents who are on the committee at committee meetings. For example, I've gone to a number of election committee meetings and ethics committee meetings and even community engagement committee meetings where I may or may not see ethics committee members attending and just kind of being there. You could say in a negative sense, lurking, waiting to observe if anyone does anything wrong. Or you could say they're just participating and observing. But why we have to wonder then, well, why did they attend this meeting and not the other? Are they observing certain people's behavior more closely? Will they be more scrutinized, blamed, judged, etc., potentially investigated for something than others will? Who knows? But I think what we have in the current proposal and in the ethics committee as a whole, unless we can have the council be the first line to hear cases and then refer them, what we have are the seeds for a high level of resident to resident conflict, because you have put residents out there. And to my mind, again, I feel like the council is offloading its responsibility to be the first line of hearing where there are concerns in the community about cases. These cases are very sensitive. People are very concerned about their reputations. It has to do with their professions. Sometimes their security clearances. There are really high stakes involved in having an investigation at all. And I think the council in the past and people on committees have done an excellent job of dealing with complaints and concerns in a kind of quiet and respectful way. And I hope that we'll get back to that, because I don't think we need to have the first line of concern about a conflict, an ethics concern, et cetera, be a resident composed committee. I also don't think it makes, I don't understand really why we need to expand the reach of this group to additional volunteers. But even beyond that, I would hope the council as a whole would at least change the order of who hears a case first, so that it protects the committee members on the ethics committee from any potential accusations of bias, that they're going after this case and not that one. At least they could say, in the same way that they said, we're not ahead of the council on this proposal. It came from one council member. At least they could say, we're not ahead of we're not ahead of the council on this proposal. We were or this case, we were referred it by the council. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Oh, and by the way, I do feel that the residents' request for a council review, a memo that was sent today that was signed by 25 residents. I think there was some reference to there were only 4 people who'd expressed concerns. Clearly, we've got 25 in this very well worded document that I think really makes some good points. I hope you'll consider them. Thank you.
I think that was a reference that was how we got to this listening session, not the subsequent letter that was submitted to the council. So I don't think there were 25 initially when we had this conversation at our last council meeting, at least not publicly yet, Susan. But thank you for your comments, Paula.
Thank you. I'm not going on video because I just had some surgery on my eye, but I have 2 thoughts. Peter's point about recusal, I think, is really important. Maybe it's not quite within this ethics ordinance, but if the state of Maryland requires it for possible conflicts, it seems that we should follow that. I mean, it's common sense anyway. And so that really struck home when he mentioned it. And secondly, for committees that, I mean, I'm thinking you're talking about the committees that handle money. Well, do they not go through a council member, i.e. a supervisor who signs off on the allotment of money? And is there not some way to see that is well scrutinized and conflicts dealt with in that capacity without the rest of the ordinance that has other issues? Anyway, those are my thoughts listening to people. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Just a quick response. I mean, I think just as an example, maybe it was the 4th of July or Halloween when we had like a food truck. I mean, it's the committee that retains, that reaches out, that proposes, and that presents that then to the council and the village manager, and we sign the checks. So the process is the committee kind of works through the organizing
Sure.
and the retaining of these folks. So but
And 2 council members always sign off on.
Right.
on the-
Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
But do we
again,
go ahead.
that seems like good sense.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the question is, do we know whether the Roaming Roosters owner is the cousin's best friend's boyfriend of a committee member? You know, I mean, these are the things that we wouldn't be aware of, I guess, as a council. But you know,
Right. And then the only way you'd know is if a competing truck brought you an issue, but you
Right.
can imagine every scenario, but I don't think we should let, perfection get in the way of the good here, and just, have some good, solid, sensible practices that people would say, yeah, that makes sense. And if a problem comes up, it gets dealt with. I mean, Susan's comments, having done ethics oversight for corporations and government for many years, the idea of whether it should go to the committee, i.e. the board, or should go to somebody who's outside that realm and is sort of staff, there's no easy answer, because, and again, I think the main thing here is to preserve trust and respect and not have people feel like somebody's playing a game of gotcha in a small town with, you know, such a good, which it has generally a very good vibe. And those are just my thoughts on the comments tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I can just, okay, Holly, go ahead. I was just going to respond to a couple of the points that have been made, but Holly, go for it.
Sorry, thank you. I don't see how anyone in the village here cannot feel like this is a game of gotcha when we are the only village that Ron knows about, except some in some other states that have anything like this. So how can this be anything other than a game of gotcha? We don't really need this law or any of it. And nobody else has it. So I don't know where anybody gets off on even having it. I don't look to have a big brother ethics committee looking me over, and I don't know anyone who would. So I just wish we could get back to live and let live. I think we've survived a long, long time without this kind of supervision, and I would be grateful if we could not continue it. So thank you.
If I can just respond to a couple of these things, and then Arthur, I see your hand up as well. Just a couple of items, and this is just kind of a gut reaction, and happy to help stimulate more conversation. I've been on this council for a year and a half. I've never, with the mechanisms in place today, with the current ethics ordinance in place, I've never felt like there was a big brother, big sister, whomever watching over my shoulder. I don't think my wife, who was on a committee, felt that way either. I think what's important to me, and this is something that Ron has provided in response to a question from a council member, is, you know, the current code, VMA code, specifically prohibits council members from serving on the ethics committee, which is designed to create an ethics body independent of elected officials and tracks with the Maryland Ethics Code. Giving the council the authority currently delegated to the ethics committee would effectively destroy the code's mandate for an independent ethics committee and would be contrary to state law. To me, this ordinance actually says if a complaint is filed and sent to the ethics committee, it needs to be, if it's actually accepted in terms of the ethics committee looking into it, it needs to be expeditiously announced to the council. So the council is not punting, the council is not delegating this, the council is still part of the process, but having an independent ethics committee that is not, you know, you can kind of flip this and say, you know, council members are maybe political in nature and want to be reelected. So what if they put their thumb on the scale here? If there's some investigation of a friend of a council member or a council member, him or herself. So having an independent committee that is appointed by the council that can also be fired in theory by the council, I think to me, philosophically makes sense to have that independence. And just like a jury on a case is not made of experts, you would hope that the jury, because I've heard this argument as well, the ethics committee, those aren't necessarily ethics experts, but just like a jury in a court case, you hope that common sense prevails, and having no member show any bias and favoritism is the case in this instance as well. I also wanted to just, you know, mention the factions. I mean, I know there's a conversation about factions. We talked about North, South. I've not experienced it. I'm part of no faction. I'm an independent. And so I don't feel like there's a dominance on this council in terms of factions. You've seen votes taken that I think may have surprised some folks, including having this listening session. But I've not heard from any committee member and folks that have volunteered and are considering to volunteer that they're fearful of this. So I think, you know, the staggered terms also, this is another thing I just wanted to talk, and we can go back and forth. I see more hands coming up, but I think that also allows for the independence. We don't have council members appointing their favorite members of this committee and folks that are closely aligned to council members. initial reactions, didn't want to continue further. Arthur and then Peter, please.
Okay.
And then Jeff. You're
Arthur, I
muted.
think you're on mute.
You're muted, Arthur. You're muted.
Okay. Andrew made some of my points, but I want to go back. The way that the village differs from other municipalities isn't that we have an ethics committee, but that we have extended it to all village committees. I believe there is a state requirement that all municipalities have ethics committees. And we did have one from the very beginning. If you go back, cast your mind back to about 4 or 5 years ago, that ethics committee had the authority to place a violator in jail for a year. Today, the only action is removal from a committee. It's not like you're going to jail, or there was also a possibility of being fined $1,000. That has been removed. But in that removal, the coverage was extended to other committees, and now we are proposing to all committees. So that's the main difference. The old ordinance, and I'm not sure if this is in the state requirements, Ron will help me on this, but the very first line of complaint was to the ethics committee, and that goes back to the very first establishment of the ethics committee in Martin's edition. It wasn't for the council to avoid responsibility, but to place the burden on an independent group that was not attached to the council. Ron, you can help me on this. Are all ethics committees, are they required for every municipality? Or is it just that all municipalities tend to adopt it? And is there a requirement written into state or county code that the first reference is to the committee and not to the elected body?
Sure. So there is a state ethics law which requires municipalities to adopt an ethics ordinance substantially similar to the state's ordinance, unless the municipality gets exempted. And Martin's Additions was exempted in 1989, I believe. And in that exemption, the ethics committee noted that, you know, we find there are good reasons to exempt Martin's Additions, and you've got an ethics ordinance on your books already. And so to the extent you keep that, you know, we find your exemption appropriate. That was in 1989. You know, now the ethics committee, as I understand, applies a rather broad rule. If your population and budget is over a certain limit, they deem you to be large enough to have to comply with all the state ethics requirements, which in the early 2000s included an amendment requiring financial disclosure by officials, that they had to disclose all their stock interests and the like. And that, I believe, caused the State Ethics Committee to revise their rules on how they granted exemptions, because that was deemed a rather burdensome requirement for small towns to have officials disclose all their investment decisions. In the state model, for those jurisdictions that have to adopt the state model, including the town of Chevy Chase and Chevy Chase Village, based on their sizes and budgets, the state mandates that you have an independent ethics commission. I haven't studied that issue in great detail, but you know, as I believe I've said before, I think there's general recognition that the ethics committee is essentially policing the elected officials and the appointed officials, and so ought to be independent and hear the complaints without undue influence from those that might be under investigation. Did I answer all your questions, Arthur?
Yeah. So I think from what you've said and what I've seen before, the main way in which the Village of Martin's Additions differs from the mainstream is that we have extended the jurisdiction to other committees other than the statutory committees. Other than that, we're well within both the custom, the practice, and the law that exist elsewhere within the state.
Yeah, and if Martin's Additions did not have an exemption, I mean, the state law defines official. Let me find this definition. I believe it includes all appointees, period.
Right. So there's nothing particularly peculiar about our practices here. That's my point.
Yeah, at the state level, official, and this, I'm reading from the model ordinance. But if you're not exempted, you have to adopt basically the model ordinance that the state provides. Official means an elected official, an employee of the town, or a person appointed to or employed by the town or any town agency, board, commission, or similar entity.
Okay. Yep. And in the other point that I was making is that the old original ethics ordinance that we had was much more onerous, much more threatening to a committee member or a violator, is that you could spend a year in prison if you did not do what was required, if a case was brought before a court. As I said earlier, the maximum penalty now is removal from a committee. They're not coming for your house or your children. That's it. Thank you.
All right, Peter, Jeff, and then Katie, please.
Thank you. I wanted to start off by saying that I am concerned personally about serving on a committee at this point, because I don't know what the likelihood of being hauled before the committee is. And I'm confident that I'm not alone in that. I think there are many people in the village who feel that way, whether you recognize it or not. Secondly, Andrew, I really appreciate that you don't perceive factionalism in the village, but I don't think there's much question that it has arisen. It's largely arisen, I think, since I'm not sure if it was 20 or 21 when some members of the council adopted rather peculiar, unusual, shall we say, provisions relating to canceling elections and other things that are still on the books that had something to do with the pandemic, but clearly continue for reasons entirely unrelated to the pandemic. There is factionalism in this town. There's no question about it, and I am very happy for you that you don't see it. And in fact, Andrew, I think it's fair to say that you came to office determined to end whatever factionalism there was, and you have tried to do that in a steadfast way. But I think that to some degree blinds you to the factionalism that is here. I think it's also fair to say that the ethics committee came into being because there was a certain kind of vendetta against one particular volunteer, and that the history of the ethics committee as it currently stands has largely been shaped by that sense of vendetta. And I don't want to go into details here. Obviously, I think most of you know what I'm talking about. And finally, as to the issue of what's the penalty that's imposed on you, it's merely that you are taken off the committee. Well, let me point out that the council already has the power, with or without the ethics committee, to take people off of any committee it wishes. It does not need an ethics committee to validate or empower the council in doing so. That that exists already. The difference between having this ethics law and not having this ethics law is that the process of taking that person off the committee becomes a public matter, a kind of trial before your neighbors, a kind of public humiliation, a kind of something that I'm sure nobody wants to go through. If this is merely a matter of taking someone off the committee or a committee, the committee, the ethics committee has been endowed with, great resources, apparently almost unlimited resources to seek a prosecution, to do something that the council already has the power to do without any expenditure whatsoever. And to assume, therefore, that some, the accused, let's say a volunteer who gets himself or herself into a little bit of trouble, is prepared to, just say, well, okay, I guess I'm just going to acknowledge to the community that I've done something terribly wrong, that I'm a bad person. I don't think people are going to be happy to do that. And that's why the committee has been given these unlimited resources, and why there will be resources demanded of the person who has been accused. I think to believe otherwise, I think is just naive. So thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And I don't know if Ron can answer this question, but I was under the impression that this is a very discrete process, that this is not a public process. If there's investigation or consideration by the ethics committee. I don't know if you can answer that, Ron, but also I don't know what I can do or what council members can do, Peter, to address the issue you raised with folks fearing or not being comfortable to volunteer on committees, because since this ethics ordinance has been in place, I don't think there's been a single case presented to the ethics committee, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm wrong. And I don't know the history of the ethics committee. I think it was created in 2015 or so. I don't know if that was related to any action or decision by the council related to a vendetta. I certainly hope not. But Ron, just as to the public part of this or not?
Yeah.
Public?
So section 4202 G, H, and I provide that proceedings are generally confidential, and the records are deemed confidential and privileged and not open to public inspection. And the complainant and respondent are prohibited from disclosing information that, again, is deemed confidential. And I believe there's a specific sentence about, yeah, here we go. The ethics committee shall meet only in closed session and make no public disclosure regarding the complaint, except as required by law or court order.
So is it an ethics violation if you go public as a member of the committee or council or anyone else?
Yes, it would be. Well, it wouldn't be it would be a municipal infraction. It would be a code violation. I don't know if it would be an ethics violation per se, but it would be a municipal infraction.
Okay, just curious, Peter. I just wanted to kind of we're doing this in real time. Anyway, Jeff, Katie, and then Elizabeth, please.
Thanks. I appreciate it. I'm going to withhold most of my substantive comments to Thursday's meeting, but just a couple quick points. First, Andrew, God bless and Godspeed that you feel that there's no factions and other things. But again, just referencing the beginning of this session, I had been singled out and pointed out as a council member the only council member who had wanted the listening session. And I can assure you, this is not the first time, and I guess it won't be the last time. So again, when you feel that you're singled out now on a council and as elected council member, I think you should expect that there'll be that sort of mud wrestling that just comes with the territory. But I think that when you are a village resident and you honestly feel that you have potential for being singled out, because we know, we could even listen to the recording of the last open council meeting where there was a discussion of singling out at least 4 residents as folks who could be troublemakers or repeatedly the same old 4. I mean, that's intimidating. So I just think that that is something that we should not discount. Just a couple of things. Ron, I had a quick question. I know that Arthur has brought up some points around it's really a good thing to extend this to perhaps the community engagement around some of the decisions that they could make. But maybe we could just clarify this whole idea of a position of public trust. Why in this case would the community engagement not be in a position of public trust? I mean, they don't sign checks. I mean, again, there, as it was pointed out, other folks are doing that. So why, just so we understand, why would the community engagement not be in that original select group of folks?
So yeah, I did a memo in 2020, and I'd like to revisit that memo. My recollection is that I found, as did Mark Efron, authority in Maryland law for when ethics rules are generally commonplace, and that's when there's an office of public trust, as you say. And we've also referred to these as statutory positions in these discussions. And those are positions that carry some sort of powers where the public trusts that its officials are going to exercise those powers appropriately. So when we talk about public trust and statutory positions, those are folks that are implementing requirements of the law, like reviewing permits, or in Martin's Additions, the tree supervisor has specific statutory duties. So that's an example of an office of public trust, right? The public trust that that official is going to do things appropriately. Does that answer your question, Jeff?
It does. I appreciate
Great.
that. And
I'm sure there
one
was
of-
more in my memo, so I'll go back and find that and I'll send it to you.
no, you're awesome. And again, I'm not going to ask for a response today, and maybe it's just something that we could discuss on Thursday. But I do know that in the code there is this indemnity clause, right? But I think it applies specifically to courts of law, if that's the case, anyone who's a council member, employee, or even volunteers, as stated in the code, that we could potentially have the right to seek counsel for defense. And so, it's interesting because, again, that's court of law. So as it applies and how it's written, it wouldn't indemnify us against something that would, perhaps come out of the ethics committee. But I was just curious your thoughts, whether it's today or Thursday. I mean, it seems that it would make sense that we would also be indemnified and be able to also seek counsel in a response. But, again, it would seem a little odd that we would have to do that out of pocket. So perhaps there is some way that, we look at this and say, yeah, I mean, it'd be great if I could, go to you, or any of us could go to you, including volunteers, to respond. I think the only question would be if the ethics committee is going to you and then we go to you, it seems that you'd have to put on 2 faces or something to put that dividing line. So over on that, and appreciate your comments today or Thursday, what your thoughts might be.
Sure. Yeah, I'll look at it and comment more on Thursday. I think you're right. That section's probably limited to situations involving court actions. And we carry insurance, the village. So, if the village is sued or a village official is sued, we've got insurance in place, and the insurance company legit would provide the defense counsel. It certainly could be extended to ethics committee administrative actions. The code could be amended if it's not covered now, but I'll look to see if it's covered now.
Thanks,
And
Ron.
why I have the floor, can I make one more comment? I need to take responsibility for the cancellation of uncontested elections. That was my idea. It wasn't a council member's idea. I mean, to the extent that this might help heal some of the hard feelings, I don't think there was any malintent there. It did come up during COVID and in response to the governor's declaration of an emergency, granting us the authority to amend our charters to relax election rules so that we could have safe elections during pandemics. And I noted to all my clients that, because a lot of the clients were paying $5,000 or similar amounts to run an election, that if you have an uncontested election, you have the option of saving yourself that expense. Chevy Chase View and Chevy Chase Village had been doing it for years. Chevy Chase View, maybe 20 years, have had that exemption on the books. So that was a recommendation I made to Martin's Additions.
We shall not forget, Ron. Okay. Katie and then Elizabeth, please.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for your explanation, Ron. That appreciate it. All I wanted to say, for whatever it's worth, I served as the liaison to the ethics committee all last year. That would have been October 2021 to their summer recess, I guess, in 2022. And now, personally, I didn't get the sense that they were seeking to be overlords. That said, I am open to hearing from others and their experiences. And going into being a liaison for the ethics committee, I viewed ethics more as Ron had mentioned, insurance, just additional insurance, more than a slippery slope. However, the participants tonight, you're offering some good food for thought. Especially, I always tend to really like, Susan Kahn. I want to go back to how you're advocating that the council be the first line of concern for these issues, and I would be open to that. I would like to revisit that with council, but moving forward, as for the factions in the VMA, they do exist, unfortunately, but I do think our chair has gone above and beyond to try and be a bridge to these factions. Case in point tonight, voting for this forum. I just wanted to put that out there, but and I think is this forum the answer to end these factions? That would be nice, But for example, I personally think it might have been helpful to have Lori, Mark, and Alex participate tonight. Just a thought, because that would be more of a dialogue. But I also appreciate the need to have space and candor. So like I said, I'm not going to say anymore. I really wanted to kick this back to the people, and I'm going to. I hope I wasn't hurt before. I was just coming off of another VMA meeting. I'm trying to be like this year's picture, everything, everywhere, all at once. But back to you all. Thanks again.
If I could just one quick response to what Katie said on the factions front. I think there are folks that don't like each other in this village, and maybe those are the factions. There are folks that continuously maybe butt heads, and it's unfortunate and it bothers me. But I can tell you there's no faction or factions on this council. Again, case in point is this listening session. If there were a dominating faction, we might not have that. I think there, as I said before, there are votes on this council that are probably as unpredictable as ever versus what was the case in the previous council, where we saw a lot of 4-1 votes. But also in terms of favoritism, I just want to be clear, I don't know who mentioned, there's a member of the ethics committee who ran for council. I pushed very hard for and was in favor for that member to be appointed, even though he ran against me or ran in that last election, and was supported by someone that probably didn't want me necessarily on the council, but I wanted him on the committee because I thought he would make a great committee member, and he has proven to be a great committee member. So I think we can all step back sometimes, or we should step back sometimes and take a deep breath and not view each other as factions, just view each other and our goals as furthering the best interests of this community and making this a place of harmony and goodwill. And that's something that I've been trying to do for the last year and a half on the council and previous 10 years off the council. And maybe one day we'll succeed, but I don't believe in factions. I believe, unfortunately, in the existence of individual residents that don't care for each other and always find each other at loggerheads, et cetera. So Elizabeth, sorry.
Okay. Am I on? Can you hear me? Okay. Good evening. And I also appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion. I didn't realize that the Ethics Committee members weren't invited to it. And I also agree that maybe that wasn't a good idea. But I'm asking myself, there is the expansion of this ordinance a solution in search of a problem? The very first thought I had, it's already been expressed, I think it was Holly that said, where was the need that, what happened, where was the need demonstrated that something more had to be done, to further the expansion? Can we, do you have any, what was the scope of the problem, basically? And you just said yourself that there haven't been any cases that you've heard of or that you know of recently. So are we over-regulating? That's my question. And I think there is a problem here, because you wouldn't have 25 or 30 people signing on again on I think a well-formulated, very factual, very clear comment to the council on issues regarding both the expansion and also the ethics ordinance itself that go back to last year. There seemed to be issues that didn't get totally attended to when it was drawn up when it was done last year. So Peter has, in his comments, has raised several points regarding recusal, regarding appointments, regarding legal assistance, for example, that go to the structure of the ethics ordinance, the original one, that I would think that need to be looked in before any expansion is made. Secondly, there is the issue of the expansion itself and what has been touched on this evening, which is people who serve on these volunteer task forces are not statutory positions of trust. I think if I heard the definition from Ron Bolt, I don't think they fit in that category. And so that also, begs the question for me, unless I misunderstood what I thought I heard. So I'm just saying, I think that there are enough people that have bothered to show up and to express their comments, and also to others who aren't here to write their comments, that you cannot push this aside. It means it needs another look. There's obviously something bothering people here. So if we could, and some of them are technical issues and they've been raised tonight with some possible solutions. I don't see any value in that Martin's Additions having to be a first to go out and initiate more restrictions if other comparable communities don't have that in place and are getting along just fine without it. And I had another thought about the ethics committee also. You used the example of a court case. I think you may even have said jury, and that's what comes to mind, that if a case presents itself, could not the council convene a partisan ethics committee on a case-by-case basis to consider whatever the issue is, and it does its job and it reports, and then it is dissolved until the next issue comes along, so that it's not a standing committee, but it's the power of the council to convene such an unbiased committee that would look at, made up of members of the community that don't have any interests, obviously meeting all the criteria of an ethics committee. that may also make it less of a burden for some people, feeling that there is a body that's, looking over or listening in or being big brother or whatever. It's just a consideration that it be convened on a case-by-case basis. And that's basically it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. And
Sure.
and just to clarify, the jury example is just in the past, folks have said that a lot of these committees that we have require folks that have expertise in a particular field for folks to be appointed. And while that's great, it excludes others that want to volunteer, and that I think our residents all have common sense and can learn any given issue. So that was one of the reasons I mentioned that. But all your points are well taken, and I really appreciate you making
Okay,
them.
sure. You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Just so you know, I would love to keep this to an hour and a half, so 15 more minutes, because I know we're going to have this opportunity again on Thursday. I hope I'm not going to shortchange anyone, but if hands continue to go up, we'll continue to have this forum, but just in the interest of time. So Marty, I see your hand.
I think Paula has her hand up first, so I'll defer.
I think Paula may not have put her hand down. If I'm wrong, Paula, please unmute yourself. But I think it just never went down again, or it never disappeared again.
Yes, I said what I said. I don't know. I'll figure out the hand thing. Sorry. Go ahead, Marty.
Keep it up, Paula. Keep it up. Okay. Go, Marty.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pick up on a few points here. I do feel singled out often by comments that are disparaging and feel targeted. And so I am one of the many people, I think, in the village who is somewhat reluctant. And Andrew, I think I told that when we talked about the election committee appointments, that I was really hesitant to put a target on my back by being on that committee, even though I have a lot of expertise there and would love to serve otherwise. I'm very, very concerned about serving under the conditions of this ordinance. And of course, we have had other people like Josh Bowers who quit as a volunteer because this ordinance was introduced back in 2021. So I think that there is a real concern, and that should not be minimized, about people putting themselves in jeopardy. I mean, back in 2019, when there was at first that policy about all volunteers having to, sign an oath of office, I was chair of the election committee, and I basically asked everybody to sign it, and that was fine. We didn't think anything of it. We were all doing it anyway. It just seemed like a statement of principle. We never dreamed that it would turn into something that could actually bounce back at us in the form of legal charges of ethics violations under this ordinance. I mean, 2019, there's an oath of office policy, fine. 2021, suddenly there's this ordinance that turns it into, that creates an enforcement mechanism that could really be pretty heavy-handed. And as Peter said, could be potentially used to target people who were not the favorites of other people in power. And that singling out is something that I have seen and experienced personally. We agreed to serve because we care. I care a lot about fair elections, but we didn't really agree to sign up as volunteers to have to defend ourselves against official legal charges of ethics violations. And that's the difference between this ordinance and what we had before the past. It wasn't made legal charges. And that the penalty here, Arthur, to go to a point you made, is not, I'm glad we got rid of the $1,000 fine and all that stuff. But the real penalty here is being subjected to the machinery to have our lives get thrown into turmoil by investigations by a 3-person committee that has really very inadequate recusal provisions. And it's just really troubling that a volunteer could be subjected to that kind of thing. The penalty is not getting removed from a committee. The penalty is having to go through this process of dealing with a prolonged and difficult personal investigation, which would just be incredibly painful for anybody. And that brings me to the CEC, because Arthur, you were the one back in March 21, when this ordinance was first approved, who proposed that the CEC and the task forces like walkability or safe not be included under the jurisdiction of this, that they not be subjected to ethics, legal charges and violations and investigations. And you were right about that. I really thank you for doing that, because you made the right call. Those are not statutory positions of trust. And in terms of handling money, Andrew, I want to go to something you said. It's true that the committee, the CEC, recommends, ice cream truck vendors and balloon vendors and whatever else. but it's not them who's signing the checks. They're not the ones making the decision. And I think the fact that the committee members already, right, the non-covered committees like the CEC, they have to fill out a conflict of interest form. So if Keith Allen, God help us, owned the ice cream truck that he's recommended, you would know that from just the COI form. You don't need to make the committee subject to legal violation charges and investigations. The COI form covers it completely. You would know that, and you would be, I mean, basically the village manager and the council make the decisions about who we hire. That is also true of the election committee, by the way, which could, we know back in 2020, when we first had to do a mail vote election, you know, we researched a whole lot of election companies that do election services, electronic, by mail, all the variations on it. We did a lot of work on that. And we recommended Electic because we did our homework, you know, with references and interviews and all that. And we recommend it, but we don't write the check. That's still a council decision or a village manager decision. So really the CEC is not in the position of handling money. They're in the position of recommending that you handle our money well. And if there was a conflict of interest for Keith or anybody else, which God knows, I'm sure there would never be, you know, that's not a reason to make him subjected to investigations. He's making a recommendation. The COI form says if there's any connection. So I think it's really important here to keep these lines clear, because there really is a chilling effect. I mean, most of the committees had only 3 people this year because Andrew, you yourself told me that there weren't enough people volunteering, and Katie, you said the same. And that's a real problem. I think we need to assess the impact this has already had on our community. The contentious process of months and months of getting the ordinance initially approved in 2021, March 2021, that was painful for a lot of people. A lot of people didn't feel heard or listened to. They felt railroaded. And the idea of now expanding it, I'm really grateful for this session tonight. Thank you all, because I think it does give people a sense of being heard and respected, which some of us, frankly, you know, haven't always had. And there's really a serious issue here about being open. You know, if we want harmony and congeniality and goodwill, which I fervently desire, we really need to listen to people here. And there are real concerns here about people feeling singled out or targeted, or about the potential misuse of this to, you know, tar and feather people with false allegations, which are not unknown in this community. And the heavy weight of this is so much different from what it used to be back in the days when I do remember Harmony, which was basically if there's a problem, you went to the village council or you worked it out. I mean, Susan Kahn referred to that there are, you know, lots of ways to solve an issue without having the artillery called in. And certainly this ordinance at the time, and still feels to me like some pretty heavy-handed major stuff. I mean, I do not want my life turned upside down by an investigation. And I think most volunteers just want to be helpful. We don't want to subject ourselves to this. And that's not what we signed up for. You know, we all went along with signing the oaths because we were already doing that anyway. We all went around with filling out the COI forms because that's useful. But this is really overkill. I think it is government overreach. And to extend it even further, Arthur, you were right in the first place. Extend it only to the committees it now covers. I really don't think it should be expanded. And let me go to a couple other points. I think that Peter's points about the lack of recusal here is really, really important. Because Maryland state law, for example, allows the person that the allegations are lodged against to, you know, ask for, you know, to petition for recusal of a judge. These folks on the ethics committee, they're not really in a position of being a jury. They're the investigators and the judges. And so I think that before you extend or even consider extending this ordinance in any way, you should really go back and, you know, correct the recusal provisions on it, because they're really not adequate the way they are now. And the business about no financial caps, that really troubles me. The election committee has a cap of, you know, what, $5,000, $6,000 for elections, which is normally, that's understood and done. And again, we don't sign the checks. The election committee doesn't sign the checks on that. But there's no financial boundary at all on what it could cost to actually bring an investigation under this ordinance, let alone an expanded ordinance where even more volunteers might be subject to investigations. You might have even more cases. So that, I mean, I'm an economist, and the finances part of this just really troubles me. The council doesn't have to approve legal fees. Basically, the committee has unlimited resources from what the ordinance says. They can incur legal expenses without even checking in with the council. That doesn't seem right to me. There's no provision about the legal expenses for volunteers in defense. I think that Peter really all talked about that. No requirement for the committee to provide a public report each year on the cost to VA. I'm very glad we haven't had a case yet. But if we had even one, it could get expensive. And Ron, I appreciate that we have insurance, but let's not go there. I don't think we need to expand the number of people who are subjected to this and thereby potentially expand the legal costs. And the question of the legal cost, I mean, there is a provision in the ordinance now that says that you could hire an outside attorney if need be, that Ron could recommend that an outside attorney be hired. Well, that's not cheap. And again, I worry about the cost here, and I worry about the fact that the ordinance is so absolutely silent about any financial caps, any requirement for approval with legal fees before the committee incurs them, any provision for legal expenses that an accused volunteer might incur, and no requirement for a public report about costs. So that's just not good government, in my humble opinion. And I would really like you, before you even consider expanding this, to clean up some structural issues like that. That's a pretty serious problem. I agree with Susan's point that the council is the one that really needs to be notified at the outset, because 99% of the time they can correct the problem with administrative action. You don't even need to put your ethics committee into gear with all the problems that could entail. You can just fix the problem. You can reprimand a volunteer, you can remove a volunteer with or without cause. You don't have to make that public. It's just done. I mean, this ordinance, the way it is written now, actually prevents the council from taking prompt supervisory action. If they're not informed about complaints up front, they can't do anything to correct the problem. So that just leaves me, in terms of management, like the cart before the horse. The referral, I mean, it's true that the council should have the power to refer a case for investigation to the ethics committee. I think that's important. And that the committee should have the power to conduct independent investigations and make findings of violations of the ordinance. That's fine. The question is all about where that initiates, where that originates. The council is ultimately responsible, and the council should make the call in the first place, which is why the council has to be notified at the outset. So please amend the ordinance to get that in the right order, because I think it's important. Having the council refer cases to the committee does not do anything to limit the committee's independence. It simply says that the council has the responsibility. And that, I think, really is an important amendment to consider before you do anything else. I also think the issue of training here really is, I know, Andrew, that you and I have discussed expertise, but on something like an ethics investigation, expertise really matters because people make mistakes. I've done a number of investigations in my professional career, as many of our residents have. I think Jeff Lander was on the ethics committee at the State Department for a while. Jeff, is that correct? And we all know that there are lots of pitfalls in ethics investigations, and it's not a case where you want to have people who have no experience or very little experience doing it. You really want people who will have expertise on this committee. On the election committee, I was always happy to train new people every year. That was a pleasure. But on this committee, the expertise, I think, really does come back. If you don't have it, it can come back to bite VMA legally in terms of cost. So the training, I mean, the training there should be some standards of training or qualifications for the people who serve on this committee, the ethics committee. And in addition, I think all volunteers should have some very specific training on the list of actions that would constitute impartiality violations before they can be charged with offenses. Right now, we do a certain minimal training, and I'm sure the committee has tried to do that, but there's no list of, this, and this can't be done, you'll get charged. And it's unfair to the volunteers not to give them a very specific list of this and that is a violation. So again, there's lots of areas here where this needs more attention to actually be workable. And the downside of not having it be really up to par is that VMA could get sued for any error that this committee makes, let alone any bias that they might have, but any errors that they make, boy, that's a lawsuit waiting to happen. I just worry about it. So there's a lot of, I think, substantive comments in that community memo that you got, the residents' request for review here, that I would really like to see the council give some very serious attention to and actually amend the basic ordinance before you adopt any proposal to expand it to cover anybody else. And I don't think, frankly, you should expand it to other volunteers. I think that's inappropriate and would only make it more likely that people aren't going to volunteer. We've already seen a fall off in volunteerism here. Certainly concerns by people like me and Peter about being targeted if we volunteer for a committee, and we're very far from being the only ones. So the final closing statement I would like to make here is that, you might want to do a cost benefit analysis to look at how this ordinance has already actually affected the village. Even though we haven't had the cost component in terms of financial legal fees, we've had real cost to the community in terms of, I think, trust and harmony and goodwill. And this ordinance, when they proposed it back in 2020 and got adopted in March 21, was very, very controversial. And it really caused months of community tension back then. So I think it's really smart to take the time now to think this through. There's no urgency that this has to be expanded to all the volunteers right now. And let's address the problems in the ordinance itself before we decide to do anything to expand its coverage. One last point I would make is that the council was right the first time when it limited the ordinance to only cover people who have those statutory positions of public trust. That was correct. Arthur, again, you were the one who made that call. And the rationale for expanding this ordinance really is kind of a bureaucratic non sequitur. It goes from the 2019 council policy that volunteers should have to all sign an oath of office. But that does not mean that all volunteers should now have to be subjected to official ethics charges and investigations. There's a gap there that doesn't follow in my thinking at all. Yes, we're fine to have them sign the oath of office. That's a commitment. Have them fill out the conflict of interest forms. That tells you if there's actually any financial conflict. That's all you need. You do not need for most of the volunteers, the ones who are not in positions of trust, to do anything more than that. So this ordinance really shouldn't apply to them. And I'll be happy to answer any questions, but I hope this is helpful because these concerns really go deep. They go to what Holly Worthington was talking about the nature and tone of our community, that we're friendly and cooperative, not that people are being singled out like, oh, if she sets 1 foot wrong, she's going to get slammed with an ethics charge. Because an ethics charge is a heavy deal. It is really disruptive to people. And going through the process of an investigation is punishment in itself. So we should really minimize any chance that volunteers would be subjected to that. All you need for the non-statutory volunteer positions is really have them sign the oath, make the commitment, and fill out a conflict of interest forms. Leave it at that. That's what we've got now. That's what we had historically before we even had official oaths. People try to do a good job, and we don't need this kind of policing. I think it really does change the tone of the whole village. It certainly has for me. So I ask you to really fix what we have first before even thinking about expanding it, and look at that residents memo and the comments tonight very seriously, because these are structural issues. And please, please, please fix them before you do anything further, because I worry about the ordinance the way it is written now. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. Okay, we're gonna finish up here with Jeff and Susan.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to defer first to Susan. Mine was like a 30-second or less sort of close. So Susan, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I was gonna say that I want to make sure that if you all are really concerned about this being an independent ethics committee, independent of the council, I would hope that over time you would be able to change the members of the ethics committee. We certainly wouldn't want a kind of Supreme Court for VMA where terms were endless. It also shouldn't obviously be the product of an individual council member's friends, for example. And I think someone has pointed out that some of the people on the committee may seem to be either the friend or the close friend or someone who has been endorsed by a particular council member. And these are things that make it look a little bit less independent. So hopefully there should be some oversight. My concern is that there isn't sufficient oversight of what happens on the committee when there are complaints or concerns. Some people today and previously have brought up that they're concerned about there being bias on the committee. And I still don't see that that's being registered among council members. I don't know if you all think about, can we look at the composition of this committee? Can we see if we think there was bias represented when they considered not to make a certain case out of a complaint about something that had happened with a council member? The fact that that was not turned into a case is an issue because there was a failure to recuse people who you would have thought would have certainly wanted to recuse themselves, holding other people's to such a high standard. Surely they would have wanted to avoid any perception of bias there. So anyway, so I'm hoping that the council, at least if you are creating this independent election committee with terms that do not coincide with electoral terms, that is out of the reach in a sense of other residents when there are complaints, hopefully you will at least exercise some oversight and be involved in ensuring that there is not bias of that nature. And one of the things I just wanted to mention, a few years ago, there was a concern about one council member who may have done something about interfering with election communications. And I thought that it was an excellent textbook way to deal with that when the person on this particular committee, the chair, brought that up to the council and said, there has been some interference with election communications. We just want to remind you that although this was done, that this is not supposed to be done by council members. That could have become an ethics violation. That could have become some sort of investigation, but it wasn't. It was handled very professionally by the person involved. And I think that the more we can rely on our own mechanisms to handle some of those disputes and concerns, the better, instead of just having the idea that the first line of hearing about those cases is going to be an ethics committee that will pass judgment on fellow residents. Because, sometimes people just make innocent mistakes. We don't, need to turn it into a really big deal. So anyway, so thank you very much. And I do hope that the committee, the composition of this ethics committee will change over time, that would represent at least that this is truly an independent committee. It's not just one composed of people who happen to know a certain person or et cetera, that there is a role that's important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Okay, Jeff, you have the final word here, unless another council member wants to speak, but I think we're
Thanks, Andrew. I certainly don't want that pressure, but I'll try and make it pretty quick. So first, I just want to thank you, fellow council members. Whether or not you voted to have this listening session, I think it was magnificent, really. I think it was a great discussion. For me personally, I thought there were some points which are recycled, but also some points that were new, gave me some new perspectives. And I anticipate on Thursday, when there's a vote for adoption, have an opportunity to synthesize those into a couple key points. And the other piece which I just wanted to share, and perhaps this is something that got lost in translation, but since I was kind of pointed out as the champion of the on the council for the listening session, right or wrong, it's a little odd to hear that the committee itself was thought that they couldn't attend. I see that the council liaison is here and made an opening statement, but I don't see where, any shape or form, there was any discussion about how committee members should not attend. In fact, prior listening sessions, I know on this topic, there were committee members that were in session. So whether or not that was lost in translation.
Yeah, I don't recall that conversation either, that prohibited or that. I mean, someone mentioned about, I don't know if it was Susan who said that there was maybe a comfort level, a safe space was the term, but I don't recall us officially saying who and who could not, who was allowed to participate, who wasn't. But okay, moving on.
Yeah. And I didn't, I'm sure, I don't know if anyone did, but I certainly didn't see any emails from committee members asking or questioning whether or not they should attend. But with that said, ending on a positive note, thank you so much, everyone's time. I really found this very helpful and informative. Appreciate it.
Yes, And I'd like to add to that. I really appreciate folks taking the time and joining and sending us their thoughts with their letter of concern and as per usual, really insightful and helpful from our residents and community members. So thank you very much, and wishing you all a good evening. So thank you very much for participating. Thank you.
Thank you.